During a night at a hotel, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw that the janitor was identical to his wife who had died 20 years ago. He approached. Ethan Walker sat alone in the dimly lit lounge of one of New York City's most luxurious hotels. The soft hum of classical music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the muffled conversations of other guests. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled with its endless energy. Yet, none of it mattered to Ethan. His focus was on the stack of documents spread across the polished oak table in front of him, the faint glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his tired eyes. It had been years since Ethan found solace in anything other than his work, after losing Helen, his wife. 2 decades ago, he had thrown himself into building his empire. Success came easily, but peace eluded him. The weight of her absence lingered like a ghost, a constant presence in the periphery of his life. As he reviewed contracts for his latest acquisition, something shifted in his peripheral vision. A figure moving in the distance caught his attention. At first, he ignored it, attributing the distraction to his exhaustion. But then, the person stepped into the soft glow of a nearby chandelier, and Ethan froze. It wasn't possible. The woman wore the uniform of the hotel's housekeeping staff, a simple black dress with a white apron. Her hair, pulled back into a neat bun, highlighted her striking features Ethan recognized too well. His heart raced as he watched her move gracefully across the room, collecting empty glasses and wiping down tables. Every detail of her face, from the curve of her jaw to the faint dimple in her cheek, mirrored Helen. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, half expecting the vision to disappear, but she didn't. She was real, tangible, and impossibly alive. For a moment, he considered the absurd possibility that Helen had somehow returned, but logic quickly intervened. This couldn't be her. Helen was gone. He had seen her lifeless body. He had buried her. Still, the resemblance was undeniable. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't take his eyes off her as she moved through the room, her every step pulling him deeper into a whirlwind of emotions. Memories of Helen flooded back. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she used to hum softly while tidying up their home, the ache in his chest, a dull throb he had learned to live with, suddenly felt sharper. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan stood. His legs felt unsteady as he crossed the room, weaving between tables until he was just a few feet away from her. The woman turned, startled by his approach. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice low and careful. I couldn't help but notice you earlier. Do you work here often?" The woman hesitated, her large brown eyes scanning him cautiously. "Yes, sir. I work the evening shift," she replied. Her tone polite but guarded. Her voice wasn't quite the same as Helen's, but it carried a similar warmth. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry if I startled you," he said quickly, forcing a smile. You remind me of someone I used to know." The woman tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Oh, someone close to you?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice softer now. "Very close." An awkward silence hung between them. Ethan knew he should walk away, let her return to her work, but he couldn't. There was something about her presence that he couldn't ignore, an almost magnetic pull. "I'm Ethan Walker," he said, extending a hand. "And you are?" She hesitated again, before shaking his hand. Lauren Jacobs. Lauren. The name didn't ring any bells, but it didn't matter. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her wasn't just a coincidence. "Well, Lauren, it's nice to meet you," he said. Do you have a moment to talk? I'd love to learn more about you." Lauren frowned slightly, glancing around the lounge. "I'm working, Mr. Walker, but if you need anything, I can get it for you." Ethan nodded, realizing how odd his request must have sounded. "Of course, I didn't mean to interrupt your work. Thank you, Lauren." As she walked away, Ethan returned to his table, his thoughts in turmoil. He had never believed in fate, but something about this encounter felt significant. Who was Lauren Jacobs? And why did she look so much like Helen? That night, Ethan couldn't focus on his work. He replayed every moment of their interaction, determined to learn more about the mysterious woman who had stirred emotions he thought were long buried. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope Ethan Walker spent the next day restless, his thoughts consumed by the woman he had met the night before, Lauren Jacobs. Her name echoed in his mind, bringing a strange mix of comfort and unease. The resemblance to Helen was uncanny, yet Lauren had her own distinct presence. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than a random encounter. By late afternoon, he found himself back at the hotel lounge, nursing a glass of scotch. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Perhaps just a glimpse of her again. As if on cue, Lauren appeared, pushing a cart stacked with cleaning supplies. She moved with the same quiet grace, her expression focused but serene. Ethan's heart quickened, and he realized he couldn't let the opportunity slip away. This time, he decided to approach her with more tact. He watched her for a moment, gathering his thoughts before walking over. Lauren noticed him and paused, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Jacobs," Ethan said, offering a warm smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Lauren straightened, her hands resting on the cart. "Mr. Walker," she replied politely. "No, you're not bothering me. Is there something I can help you with?" Ethan hesitated for a beat, then gestured toward a nearby table. "Actually, I was hoping to have a word with you. Just a quick conversation, if you have a moment." Lauren glanced around, as if assessing whether she could spare the time. After a moment, she nodded. "I suppose I can take a short break." They sat across from each other, the polished surface of the table reflecting the soft glow of the chandelier above. Ethan studied her closely, noting the subtle differences that set her apart from Helen. The way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the faint scar along her left eyebrow. "So," Lauren began, breaking the silence, "what did you want to talk about?" Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I won't beat around the bush, Lauren. You remind me of someone very important to me, someone I lost a long time ago." Her brows furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly. "I see. Is that why you approached me yesterday?" "Yes," Ethan admitted. "I know it sounds strange, but the resemblance is remarkable. It's been on my mind ever since." Lauren seemed to consider his words carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Walker, but I'm not sure why I remind you of her." Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, he decided on honesty. "Her name was Helen. She was my wife. She passed away years ago. And seeing you brought back memories I thought I'd buried." Lauren's expression softened, a hint of sympathy flickering in her eyes. "That must have been hard," she said quietly. "Losing someone you love like that." "It was," Ethan said, his voice low. "And I'm sorry if my reaction yesterday made you uncomfortable." "It wasn't my intention." Lauren shook her head. "It's okay. I guess I'm just not used to people paying much attention to me." Ethan frowned. "Why would you say that?" She shrugged, her gaze dropping to the table. "I'm just a cleaner, Mr. Walker. People don't usually stop to notice us." "That's a shame," Ethan said firmly. "Because you're clearly someone worth noticing." Lauren looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Lauren, I'd like to help you," he said. "You mentioned last night that you work evenings here. Are you pursuing any other opportunities? Studying, perhaps?" Lauren blinked, caught off guard by the question. Well, no. I've thought about going back to school, but it's hard to find the time or the money." Ethan nodded, as though he had expected the answer. "What if I offered to sponsor your education? Cover the costs? Give you the resources you need?" Lauren's eyes widened in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because I believe in helping people who deserve it," Ethan said simply. "And you strike me as someone who does." Lauren stared at him, her expression a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "That's incredibly generous of you, but I'm not sure I can accept." "Why not?" "Because I don't know you," she admitted. "And I'm not used to people offering help without wanting something in return." Ethan smiled faintly. "I understand your hesitation. All I'm asking is that you think about it. No strings attached. Just an opportunity to pursue what you want in life." Lauren hesitated, her gaze searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," Ethan said, his tone warm. "Take your time, and if you decide to accept, just let me know." As Lauren stood to leave, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. She might not trust him yet, but this was a start. Watching her walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, and he was determined to find out what that reason was. Ethan Walker sat in his penthouse suite later that night, staring at the city lights through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The scotch in his hand had long gone warm, but he didn't care. His mind was elsewhere, stuck in a loop of memories that had been stirred by his encounters with Lauren. Helen, the name itself carried a weight that Ethan hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Her laughter, her gentle touch, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about their dreams. Everything about her had been etched into his soul. Losing her had been like losing a part of himself, a wound that never fully healed. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, letting the memories wash over him. They had met on a crisp autumn day in Central Park. Helen had been sitting on a bench, sketching the vibrant reds and golds of the trees around her. Ethan, who had been jogging through the park, stopped to tie his shoe and accidentally knocked over her bag of pencils. She had laughed, brushing off his apologies, and offered him a bright smile that instantly disarmed him. "You've ruined my masterpiece," she teased, holding up her sketch pad. "I'll buy you a new one," Ethan had replied, grinning. "But only if you let me take you to dinner." It was the kind of line that could have backfired, but Helen had found it charming. That night marked the beginning of a love story that felt like it was meant to be. Their relationship had been full of small, perfect moments. Lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers, spontaneous trips to the coast, and late-night talks about the future. Helen had been the grounding force in Ethan's life, the one who reminded him that success meant nothing without love and connection. And then, it was gone. Ethan opened his eyes, the sharp ache of grief pressing against his chest. He hadn't thought about that day in the park in years. He'd buried those memories deep, convinced that reliving them would only make the pain worse. But Lauren had changed that. Seeing her had cracked open a door he thought was permanently sealed. He got up and walked to the small desk by the window. Pulling open a drawer, he took out a small leather-bound journal. It was one of Helen's old sketchbooks, the pages filled with drawings of the places they had visited together. He flipped through it slowly, his fingers tracing the lines of her delicate handwriting. As he turned the pages, something fell out. A small photograph tucked between the pages. It was a picture of Helen holding a newborn baby, her face radiant with joy. Ethan felt his breath catch. The photo had been taken in the hospital the day their daughter was born. Lila. The name felt foreign on his tongue, a name he hadn't spoken in decades. She had been just a baby when the accident happened, too young to remember her mother's smile or her father's arms. Losing both Helen and Lila in one night had nearly destroyed Ethan. He had spent years blaming himself, wondering if there was something he could have done to change their fate. He stared at the photo for a long time before tucking it back into the journal. His thoughts drifted back to Lauren, the way she carried herself, her expressions, even the way her voice softened when she spoke. It all felt so familiar. It wasn't just her resemblance to Helen. There was something deeper, something that tugged at his instincts. Could she really be? Ethan shook his head, forcing the thought away. It was impossible. Lila had died. There had been a funeral, a tiny casket, and an endless parade of condolences from people who couldn't possibly understand the depth of his pain. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He needed answers. The next morning, Ethan made a call to a private investigator he'd worked with in the past. His instructions were simple but urgent. Find out everything about Lauren Jacobs, where she was born, who her parents were, and how she had ended up working at the hotel. Ethan didn't care what it cost. He needed to know the truth. Later that day, as he sat in the lounge waiting for Lauren's shift to begin, Ethan found himself replaying every moment of their interactions. She had been polite but cautious, her guard up just enough to make him wonder what kind of life she had lived. The faint scar above her eyebrow hinted at struggles she hadn't mentioned, and the way she spoke about her past suggested a life of hardship. When Lauren finally appeared, pushing her cart through the lounge, Ethan felt a rush of anticipation. He didn't approach her this time, choosing instead to watch from a distance. He noticed how she interacted with her co-workers, friendly but reserved, and how she took extra care to make sure every detail of her work was perfect. It was that attention to detail that reminded him so much of Helen. As Lauren moved closer, Ethan caught a glimpse of something on her wrist, a simple silver bracelet with a small charm dangling from it. His heart stopped. The charm was engraved with 2 letters, H and W. Ethan leaned back in his chair. His mind racing. That bracelet had been a gift from him to Helen when they were first married. She had worn it every day, even after Lila was born. What was it doing on Lauren's wrist? He clenched his fists, the faint glimmer of hope now burning like a flame. He needed to talk to Lauren again. But this time, he would tread carefully. If there was even the slightest chance that she was connected to Helen, he couldn't risk scaring her away. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just chasing shadows anymore. He was chasing the truth. Ethan Walker sat in his office, the morning sunlight pouring through the tall windows, illuminating the meticulously organized space. His usual focus on work had been replaced by a single goal: uncovering the truth about Lauren Jacobs. The previous night's discovery of the bracelet had shaken him to his core. The charm with the initials H and W was too much of a coincidence to ignore. The private investigator he'd hired, Richard Hayes, was one of the best. Ethan had worked with him years ago on a corporate espionage case, and Hayes had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. As the phone on Ethan's desk rang, he grabbed it immediately, knowing who it would be. "Walker," Ethan said, his voice steady but tense. "It's Hayes," the investigator replied. "I've got some preliminary information for you." Ethan leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "What did you find?" "Well, Lauren Jacobs is a bit of a mystery," Hayes began. "She was raised in an orphanage in upstate New York. Records show she was left there as an infant. No birth certificate, no known parents. She stayed in the system until she aged out at 18. Ethan frowned. "No family at all. No clues about who left her there." "None," Hayes confirmed. "The orphanage files mention a woman dropping her off, but she didn't leave a name or any identifying information. Just said the baby's name was Lauren, and that she needed to be kept safe." Ethan's heart pounded. "What about the bracelet she wears? Did anyone mention it?" "I'm still digging into that," Hayes said. "But I can tell you one thing. The woman who left her was described as having dark hair and wearing sunglasses. She didn't stick around long enough for anyone to get a good look." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Could it really have been Helen? The timeline would match. Lauren looked to be in her early 20s, which aligned with when Helen and Lila had died. But why would Helen hide their daughter? And why had Ethan been left to believe she was gone? "Keep looking," Ethan said finally. "I want to know everything. Where she's lived, who she's associated with, everything." "You got it," Hayes replied. "I'll be in touch." Ethan hung up and stared out the window, his thoughts a tangled mess of hope and doubt. If Lauren truly was Lila, why had Helen kept her existence a secret? And if she wasn't, why did everything about her feel so familiar? Later that day, Ethan returned to the hotel lounge, the place now feeling less like a luxury escape and more like a gateway to answers. Lauren was there, methodically wiping down tables and chatting briefly with a coworker. Ethan waited until she was alone before approaching her. "Lauren," he called softly, catching her attention. She turned, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "Mr. Walker, back again?" Ethan smiled. "I find this place conducive to thinking," he said, gesturing to the lounge. "But I was hoping I could talk to you again, just for a moment." Lauren hesitated but nodded. "Sure." They sat at the same table as before, the familiarity of the setting making the moment feel oddly intimate. Ethan studied her carefully, looking for traces of recognition in her eyes. But her guarded demeanor gave nothing away. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," Ethan began. "You mentioned growing up in an orphanage. That must have been difficult." Lauren shrugged, her fingers fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. "It was all I knew. The people there were kind, but it wasn't exactly a home." Ethan's gaze dropped to the bracelet, the charm catching the light. "That bracelet you wear. It's unique. May I ask where you got it?" Lauren blinked, surprised by the question. "I've had it as long as I can remember. The woman who left me at the orphanage put it on me. The staff said it was the only thing she brought with me." Ethan felt a surge of emotion but kept his expression neutral. "Do you know what the initials stand for?" Lauren shook her head. No idea, I've always wondered, but it's not like I had anyone to ask. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He needed to tread carefully. If she was connected to Helen, it was clear Lauren didn't know it, but the bracelet, combined with her appearance, was too much to ignore. You deserve answers, Lauren, Ethan said, his voice steady. Have you ever thought about looking into your past? She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you ask? Because I think you're extraordinary, Ethan said truthfully. And because I have the means to help, if you ever want to investigate your family history, I'd be more than willing to support you. Lauren studied him, her expression unreadable. That's kind of you, Mr. Walker, but I'm not sure what I'd even look for. The past feels like a door that's been closed for a long time. Sometimes doors can be reopened, Ethan said gently, and what's behind them might surprise you. Lauren gave a small, cautious smile. I'll think about it. Ethan nodded, satisfied for now. As she returned to her work, he felt the weight of the bracelet's significance pressing down on him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but there were still too many questions unanswered. He would find those answers, no matter what it took. Ethan Walker's office was unusually quiet the next morning, the hum of activity in the background failing to penetrate the heavy thoughts that occupied his mind. The phone call from Richard Hayes the day before had left him with more questions than answers. The mystery surrounding Lauren's origins was growing deeper, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. The day dragged on as Ethan awaited the next update from Hayes. Each passing hour felt heavier, as if the truth he sought was dangling just out of reach. Finally, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, the phone rang. Walker, Ethan answered immediately, his voice sharp with anticipation. It's Hayes, the investigator said, his tone professional as always. I've got more for you. Go on, Ethan urged, leaning forward in his chair. I dug into Lauren's life after she left the orphanage. She's lived a modest life, bouncing between part-time jobs and shared apartments in New York City. There's nothing remarkable in her history, at least not on the surface, but there is one thing that stands out. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. What is it? There's a gap in her records, Hayes explained. From the time she was 18 until she turned 20, there's no paper trail, no employment records, no rental agreements, nothing. It's like she vanished for 2 years. Ethan frowned. That's odd. Any idea what happened during that time? Not yet, Hayes admitted. But here's where it gets interesting. One of her old co-workers mentioned something about her carrying a small box everywhere she went. They said she was protective of it, almost secretive. A box, Ethan repeated, his mind racing. Did anyone ever see what was inside? No, Hayes said, but it might be worth asking her about. Ethan sat back, his thoughts spinning. A missing 2 years in a mysterious box. The pieces were becoming more intricate, but the picture they formed was still unclear. Keep digging, he instructed, and let me know the moment you find anything else. You got it, Hayes replied before hanging up. Ethan set the phone down and stared out the window. The missing years in Lauren's life felt significant, like a void where the answers he sought might be hidden. He resolved to find a way to bring it up with her, though he knew he would need to tread carefully. That evening, Ethan found himself back at the hotel lounge, a routine that had quickly become second nature. Lauren was there, as usual, moving with quiet efficiency as she worked. This time, Ethan waited for her shift to end before approaching her. He spotted her gathering her belongings near the staff exit, the same silver bracelet glinting under the fluorescent lights. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward. Lauren, he called, his voice steady but warm. She turned, surprise flashing across her face. Mr. Walker, didn't expect to see you here again. Ethan offered a small smile. I seem to find myself drawn to this place lately. Do you have a moment? Lauren glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Ethan. I guess I do. What's on your mind? Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to ask you about something. It might sound a bit unusual, but I promise there's a reason behind it. Okay, Lauren said slowly, her curiosity piqued. You mentioned growing up in an orphanage, Ethan began. Ethan, and I know it must not have been easy, but I also heard you kept a box with you for years. Something personal, perhaps. Lauren's expression shifted, her guarded demeanor slipping into place. "Who told you about that?" Ethan held up a hand, his tone gentle. "A little birdie. I don't mean to pry, but it sounded like it might be important to you." Lauren crossed her arms, her gaze wary. "It's just some old stuff, nothing worth talking about. Sometimes the things we keep closest to us are the most meaningful," Ethan said softly. "I only ask because I want to understand you better." Lauren's defenses wavered, and she let out a reluctant sigh. "It's just a few things I've had since I was a kid. Photos, trinkets, stuff from the orphanage." "Photos," Ethan repeated, his pulse quickening. "Of what?" Lauren hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of me as a baby? There's not much. Just 1 or 2 pictures." "Why are you so interested?" Ethan's heart pounded as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Because I think those pictures might hold answers to questions you've never thought to ask." Lauren frowned, confusion and suspicion mingling in her expression. "What kind of answers?" "The kind that could change everything," Ethan said, his voice almost a whisper. "Lauren, if you'll let me, I'd like to help you uncover the truth about your past." Lauren stared at him, her mind clearly racing. "Why do you care so much?" Ethan met her gaze, his own eyes filled with determination. "Because I believe you're extraordinary, Lauren, and I think your story is far from ordinary." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Lauren nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll bring the box tomorrow, but I'm not making any promises. That's all I ask," Ethan said with a small smile. "Thank you." As she walked away, Ethan felt a surge of hope. The missing pieces of Lauren's life were slowly coming into focus, and he was determined to fit them together. Whatever secrets that box held, Ethan knew they were a step closer to the truth he had been seeking for 2 decades. Ethan arrived at the hotel lounge earlier than usual, his anticipation mounting with each passing minute. Lauren's agreement to bring her box had left him restless the entire night. He couldn't stop imagining what might be inside. Pictures, documents, or even something that could finally confirm the nagging suspicion that had taken root in his mind. The lounge was quiet when Lauren walked in, a small, weathered box clutched tightly in her hands. Her usual confidence was replaced with an air of uncertainty, as if she were second-guessing her decision to share something so personal. Ethan stood as she approached, offering a reassuring smile. "You didn't have to do this," Ethan said gently as she sat down across from him. Lauren placed the box on the table and glanced at it, her fingers brushing over its edges. "I've had this box for as long as I can remember," she said, her voice low. "I've never shown it to anyone before. I guess I'm not even sure why I'm showing it to you. Because sometimes sharing the weight of something makes it easier to carry," Ethan replied, "and I promise to treat whatever's inside with care." Lauren studied him for a moment before nodding. She carefully lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of items: a faded photograph, a silver locket, and a small, worn teddy bear. Ethan's breath caught as his eyes landed on the photograph. It was an old picture, slightly yellowed with age, of a woman holding an infant. The woman's face was obscured by the angle, but there was something familiar about her posture, the way her head tilted slightly as she looked down at the child. Ethan reached for the photo, pausing just before his fingers touched the edge. "May I?" he asked. Lauren nodded hesitantly, watching as Ethan picked up the photo. He studied it closely, his heart pounding. The woman's hands, her slim fingers adorned with simple rings, looked strikingly similar to Helen's, but it was the infant that held his attention. The baby wore a bracelet on its tiny wrist, a bracelet with a small charm. His heart sank and soared at once. The charm was identical to the one Lauren now wore. "Do you know who this woman is?" Ethan asked, his voice unsteady. Lauren shook her head. "No, the orphanage said she was the one who left me there, but she didn't give her name. This photo and the bracelet were all she left behind." Ethan set the photo down carefully and looked at Lauren. "That bracelet, it's more significant than you realize." Lauren frowned, glancing at the charm on her wrist. "Why? It's just a bracelet." "It's not just a bracelet," Ethan said firmly. "I gave one exactly like it to my wife, Helen, when we were first married. It was custom made. There aren't any others like it." Lauren stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you saying this belonged to your wife?" "I don't know for certain," Ethan admitted. though his gut told him otherwise. But the resemblance, the bracelet, and now this photo, it's too much to ignore. Lauren looked down at the bracelet, her fingers tracing the charm. "But that doesn't make sense," she said quietly. "Why would your wife leave me at an orphanage, and why wouldn't she tell you?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his own questions pressing down on him. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her expression conflicted. "This is a lot to take in. I don't even know what to think." "I understand," Ethan said softly, "and I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. But Lauren, if you'll let me, I want to help you. I want to uncover the truth. For both of us." Lauren met his gaze, her eyes searching his for sincerity. "Okay," she said after a long pause. "But if we're doing this, I need to know the truth too. No half answers, no secrets. You have my word," Ethan replied. That night, Ethan contacted Richard Hayes, relaying everything he had learned. The photograph and bracelet added new layers to the mystery, and Ethan's determination only grew. Hayes promised to expedite the investigation, focusing on records from the orphanage and any connections to Helen. The following days were a blur of anticipation and tension. Ethan met with Lauren whenever their schedules allowed, each conversation peeling back another layer of their shared history. Lauren began to open up more, sharing stories from her childhood, her struggles, her dreams, and the unanswered questions that had always lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as they sat together in the lounge, Lauren spoke hesitantly. "Do you think this is really possible? That I'm connected to you?" Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. "I think it's more than possible, Lauren. I think it's likely. And if it's true, it changes everything." Lauren nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. "Then I guess there's no turning back now." Ethan reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "We'll face whatever comes next together." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he was on the brink of something extraordinary. The answers he sought were within reach, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Ethan Walker sat in his sleek black sedan, staring at the towering office building in front of him. The reflective glass exterior gave nothing away about the man inside. Andrew Walker, his younger brother, and the last person Ethan wanted to see. Yet, if there were answers to the questions swirling in his mind, Andrew might hold the key. Ethan had spent the past 2 days analyzing every detail of Lauren's box, cross-referencing the photo and bracelet with memories of Helen. Each clue led back to one undeniable conclusion. Lauren was connected to Helen, and Andrew had been heavily involved in the aftermath of her death. His sudden ascent in the company after Helen's accident, coupled with his evasiveness over the years, painted a damning picture. Ethan inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. He hadn't confronted Andrew about Helen's death in decades, unwilling to relive the pain. But now, with Lauren's existence potentially rewriting everything he thought he knew, he had no choice. He stepped out of the car and strode toward the building, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, but Ethan waved her off. "I'm here to see Andrew. He's expecting me." Without waiting for a response, Ethan made his way to the private elevator that led to Andrew's executive suite. The ride up felt interminable, the silence in the elevator amplifying his racing thoughts when the door slid open. He stepped into Andrew's spacious office, where his brother sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk. "Ethan," Andrew greeted, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "What an unexpected surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk now." Andrew raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading slightly. "Sounds serious? Should I be worried?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "That depends on what you have to say." Andrew gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "By all means, have a seat." Ethan remained standing. "I'm not here for small talk, Andrew. I need the truth about Helen, about her death, and about everything you've been hiding." Andrew's expression darkened, his posture stiffening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "I've spent years trying to move on, trying to believe that what happened to Helen was just a tragic accident. But now, I'm starting to see the cracks in the story, and your fingerprints are all over them." Andrew stood, his palms pressing against the desk as he leaned forward. "You've always been good at spinning conspiracy theories, Ethan. But accusing me of hiding something about Helen, that's crossing a line." "Is it?" Ethan shot back. "Because I've been uncovering things that don't add up. A missing bracelet, a photograph, and a young woman who looks exactly like Helen. Do you expect me to believe this is all coincidence?" Andrew's smirk returned, but it was colder this time. "A young woman who looks like Helen. You've really gone off the deep end." "I know you were involved," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You had everything to gain from Helen's death. She stood in the way of your ambitions, and once she was gone, you didn't waste a second stepping into the spotlight." Andrew scoffed. "That's rich coming from you. You were the grieving husband, wallowing in self-pity while the rest of us picked up the pieces. Don't blame me for taking charge when you couldn't." Ethan's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay composed. "This isn't about me. It's about the truth. And if you had anything to do with Helen's death, I will find out." Andrew circled the desk, closing the distance between them. "Careful." "Big brother," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Throwing around accusations without proof can be dangerous. You wouldn't want to tarnish that pristine reputation of yours." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't about reputation. This is about justice. And I'm not going to stop until I get it." Andrew chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You always did love playing the hero. But let me give you some advice, Ethan. Some truths are better left buried. Dig too deep, and you might not like what you find." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "That sounds like a confession." "It's a warning," Andrew replied, his smirk fading. "Walk away, Ethan, for your sake and everyone else's." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. Andrew's demeanor, so calm yet so calculating, only fueled Ethan's suspicions. But without concrete evidence, this confrontation would only be the beginning. "I'm not walking away," Ethan said finally. "You can try to scare me, Andrew, but it won't work. You'll slip up eventually, and when you do, I'll be there." Andrew's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself." Ethan turned on his heel and left the office, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and determination. Andrew's evasiveness only confirmed what he already suspected. There was more to Helen's death than anyone had admitted, and Andrew was at the center of it. As the elevator descended, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Richard Hayes. "I found something. Call me ASAP." Ethan's pulse quickened. Whatever Hayes had uncovered, it was another piece of the puzzle. And this time, he was certain it would bring him closer to the truth. Ethan sat in his study, his hands gripping the edges of his desk, as the tension from his meeting with Andrew lingered. The call from Richard Hayes had been brief but promising. He'd uncovered something significant about Lauren's past. Now, Ethan waited impatiently for Hayes to arrive, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. "Come in," Ethan called. Hayes entered, a leather folder tucked under his arm. His expression was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "I've got something that might answer a few of your questions, or raise a lot more." Ethan gestured for him to sit. "Tell me." Hayes placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing a series of documents and photographs. "I managed to track down some additional records from the orphanage Lauren stayed at. Most of it is routine, but there's one entry that stood out." He slid a photocopy of a handwritten note across the desk. The paper was old and slightly faded, but the words were clear. "Her name is Lauren. Keep her safe. She mustn't know the truth until it's time." Ethan's breath caught. "Who wrote this?" "No signature," Hayes replied. "But the handwriting is precise, deliberate. It's almost like whoever wrote it wanted to stay anonymous." Ethan stared at the note, the weight of the words sinking in. "Until it's time," he murmured. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "But there's more." He pulled out a photograph and placed it beside the note. It was an old picture of a woman with dark hair, her face partially obscured by a scarf and sunglasses. She was holding a bundle that could only be a baby. This was taken the day Lauren was left at the orphanage. The staff couldn't identify the woman, but they remembered her saying she needed to keep the baby hidden. Ethan's heart raced as he studied the photo, the woman's posture, her slim figure. Everything about her seemed eerily familiar. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. It could be Helen. That's what I thought, Hayes said. But I couldn't confirm it. The photo's too grainy for a positive ID. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. If the woman was Helen, it meant she had survived the accident, at least long enough to protect Lauren. But why hadn't she come to him? Why had she chosen to hide their daughter instead of turning to him for help? As he struggled to make sense of it all, Hayes cleared his throat. There's one more thing, he said, pulling out another document. Lauren's medical records from the orphanage. She was brought in with a small scar on her left shoulder. The staff didn't think much of it at the time, but they noted it in her file. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What kind of scar? Like a surgical incision, Hayes replied. The kind you'd see after a procedure. Ethan's pulse quickened. Helen had once mentioned a minor surgery Lila had undergone as a baby. A procedure to correct a congenital issue. Could the scar on Lauren's shoulder be the same? Thank you, Hayes, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Keep digging. I need more proof. Hayes nodded and left the room, leaving Ethan alone with the fragments of a truth that was slowly coming into focus. The next day, Ethan met Lauren at the hotel lounge. She was quieter than usual, her eyes clouded with thoughts she hadn't voiced yet. As they sat down, Ethan noticed she was clutching the bracelet on her wrist, her thumb brushing over the charm as if seeking comfort. I brought the box again, Lauren said, placing it on the table. There's something I didn't show you last time. Ethan's brow furrowed. What is it? Lauren opened the box and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, revealing what looked like a birth certificate. Ethan leaned closer, his breath catching as he read the details. Name, Lauren. Mother, H. Walker. Father, unknown. Ethan's heart pounded. The initials confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was in the box when I found it, Lauren said. I never really understood what it meant. I figured, Walker was just a name, not someone important. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes filled with emotion. Lauren, I think this might be your mother's name. Helen Walker. Lauren's expression shifted, confusion and disbelief flashing across her face. What are you saying? That this woman, she's my mother. I don't know for certain, Ethan admitted, but it's starting to look that way. Lauren stared at the paper, her fingers trembling. If this is true, why wouldn't she tell me? Why would she leave me at an orphanage? Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I don't have all the answers yet, but I promise you, we'll find out. Lauren nodded slowly. Lauren, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Okay, but I need to know the truth, Ethan, no matter what it is. You will, Ethan said firmly. We're getting closer. As Lauren tucked the birth certificate back into the box, Ethan felt a surge of determination. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, but the picture they formed was far from complete. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful or shocking it turned out to be. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just chasing shadows. He was chasing the future. Ethan's mind raced as he reviewed the revelations from the past few days. Every piece of evidence pointed toward one truth. Lauren was deeply connected to Helen. But the question of why Helen had hidden Lauren and the circumstances of her disappearance loomed larger than ever. That morning, Ethan sat in his study, poring over the birth certificate Lauren had shown him. The initials H. Walker were etched into his mind. He had spent hours studying the handwriting on the note left at the orphanage and comparing it to old letters from Helen. The similarity was undeniable, yet the why eluded him. The buzz of his phone broke his concentration. Glancing at the screen, he saw Hayes' name flashing. Hayes, Ethan said, answering immediately. Do you have something for me? There was a pause on the other end when Hayes spoke. His tone was more serious than usual. Ethan, we need to talk, and not over the phone. Ethan's stomach tightened. What's going on? I've been following some leads, and it seems like someone else is watching Lauren. Maybe even you, Hayes said. Meet me at my office. I'll explain everything. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Ethan arrived at Hayes' office. A modest but well-secured space in Midtown Manhattan, the investigator ushered him in quickly, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" Ethan demanded. Hayes motioned to a series of photographs spread across his desk. "I noticed a man following me while I was looking into Lauren's background. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I started seeing him near the hotel too." Ethan leaned over the desk, studying the photos. They showed a man in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive suit, loitering near familiar locations. The orphanage, the hotel, even Ethan's office building. "Who is he?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "I ran his face through some databases," Hayes said. "His name is Victor Brandt. He's a corporate fixer, works for high-level clients, handling their problems. He's been connected to your brother Andrew on several occasions." Ethan's chest tightened. "Andrew? It gets worse," Hayes continued. "I intercepted a message he sent. It was vague, but it mentioned keeping an eye on the girl. I think Lauren is in danger." Ethan's jaw clenched as anger flared within him. "That bastard. He's trying to cover his tracks." "Looks that way," Hayes said. "Whatever Andrew's involved in, he's clearly willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it buried." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "We need to protect Lauren. If Andrew thinks she's a threat, he won't hesitate to hurt her." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "What's the plan?" "I'll handle Andrew," Ethan said firmly. "But I need you to keep an eye on Lauren. Make sure she's safe at all times." "Consider it done," Hayes replied. Ethan left the office, his mind churning with fury and determination. Andrew had crossed too many lines, and Ethan was done playing his games. That evening, Ethan returned to the hotel to find Lauren finishing her shift. She looked up as he approached, her guarded expression softening when she saw him. "Hey," she said. "You look like you've had a rough day." Ethan managed a faint smile. "You could say that. Can we talk for a moment?" Lauren nodded, following him to a quieter corner of the lounge. She folded her arms, watching him with curiosity. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. He didn't want to alarm her, but she needed to understand the gravity of the situation. "Lauren, there's something you should know, my brother Andrew. He's been keeping an eye on you." Lauren frowned. "Why would he care about me?" "I don't think it's you specifically," Ethan said carefully. "I think it's about your connection to Helen. He's trying to protect his secrets, and he sees you as a threat." Lauren's eyes widened. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I don't know for sure," Ethan admitted. "But I've hired someone to keep an eye on things. You'll be safe." Lauren leaned back, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "This is insane. I'm just... me. I don't even know why any of this is happening." Ethan reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. "I know it's overwhelming, but I promise you, I'll get to the bottom of this. You're not alone in this, Lauren." She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the charm on her bracelet. "Okay, but what are you going to do?" "I'm going to confront Andrew," Ethan said firmly. "He needs to know that I'm onto him, and that I won't let him hurt you." Lauren hesitated before giving a small nod. "Be careful," Ethan smiled faintly. "Always." The following morning, Ethan arrived at Andrew's office unannounced. This time, he didn't bother with subtlety. Bursting through the door, he found Andrew seated at his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Ethan," Andrew said, leaning back in his chair. "This is becoming a habit." Ethan slammed his hands on the desk, his voice low and menacing. "Stay away from Lauren." Andrew's smirk faltered. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Ethan snapped. "I know about Victor Brandt. I know you've been having her followed." Andrew's eyes narrowed. "You've been busy uncovering the truth you've been hiding for years," Ethan retorted. "I'm done playing games, Andrew. If you come near her again, I'll destroy you." Andrew's smile returned, colder this time. "Careful, Ethan. You're walking a dangerous line." Ethan straightened, his gaze unwavering. "Consider this your last warning." As he turned and walked out, Ethan felt the weight of his anger fueling his determination. Andrew's threats wouldn't deter him. If anything, they only made him more certain that the truth was within reach. Ethan returned to his penthouse that evening, his confrontation with Andrew still replaying in his mind. His brother's veiled threats and cryptic remarks had done little to shake his resolve. If anything, they confirmed what he already suspected. Andrew was hiding something monumental, and Lauren's existence was at the center of it all. The phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Richard Hayes. Hayes, Ethan answered quickly. What do you have? I dug deeper into the orphanage records, Hayes said, and I found something you're going to want to see. Are you at home? Yes, Ethan replied. Come over. Within an hour, Hayes arrived, his leather folder tucked under his arm as usual. He wasted no time, spreading documents and photos across Ethan's desk. I cross-referenced the orphanage's records with hospital admissions in the same time frame, Hayes began, and I found something unusual. He slid a document toward Ethan. It was a hospital record from over 2 decades ago, detailing an admission under the name Helen Walker. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This can't be, Ethan murmured, scanning the document. She was gone before this. Hayes shook his head. Not according to this. She was admitted under a pseudonym for a minor injury. Nothing life-threatening. But here's where it gets interesting. He handed Ethan another paper. This one a discharge form from the same hospital. The date was just days before Lauren was left at the orphanage. Are you saying Helen survived? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That she left Lauren there. That's what the records suggest, Hayes confirmed. But there's more. The hospital staff noted that Helen was extremely paranoid during her stay. She refused to provide contact information and insisted on paying in cash. Ethan's mind raced as the pieces began to fit together. Helen had survived the accident, but for some reason, she'd chosen to hide Lauren. But why? And why hadn't she reached out to him? There's one more thing, Hayes said, pulling out a faded photograph. This was taken at the hospital. Ethan's breath caught as he stared at the image. It showed Helen, her face gaunt but unmistakable, holding an infant wrapped in a blanket. The love and pain in her eyes were palpable. This was right before she disappeared, Hayes said. The hospital staff said she left in the middle of the night without a word. Ethan clenched his fists, a surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. She was protecting Lauren, he said softly. But from what? Hayes hesitated before answering. That's the part I haven't figured out yet. But given what we know about Andrew, I'd bet he has something to do with it. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. I need to confront him again. He knows more than he's letting on. The next morning, Ethan called Lauren, asking her to meet him at the lounge. When she arrived, he noticed the weariness in her eyes, the weight of everything they'd uncovered starting to take its toll. I found something, Ethan said, sliding the hospital photo across the table. Lauren stared at it, her brow furrowing. Brow. Is this her? I believe so, Ethan said. This was taken right before you were left at the orphanage. Lauren's fingers trembled as she picked up the photo, her eyes scanning every detail. She looks tired, scared. She was, Ethan said gently, but she was also determined to protect you. That's why she left you somewhere safe. Lauren's voice wavered as she asked, why didn't she tell you? Why didn't she come to you for help? Ethan sighed, the question weighing heavily on him. I don't know, but I think it has something to do with my brother. He's been hiding things for years, and I intend to find out why. Lauren set the photo down, her expression hardening. I want to be there when you do. Ethan hesitated. Lauren, this could get dangerous. I don't care, she said firmly. This is about my life, my past. I deserve to know the truth as much as you do. Ethan nodded slowly, seeing the resolve in her eyes. All right, but we'll do this carefully. Andrew won't go down without a fight. Ethan and Lauren arrived at Andrew's office later that afternoon, the tension between them palpable. This time, they weren't here for pleasantries. Andrew looked up as they entered, his smirk faltering slightly when he saw Lauren by Ethan's side. Well, this is unexpected, Andrew said, leaning back in his chair. What brings you both here? We're done with the lies, Ethan said, his voice cold. It's time you told us the truth. Andrew's expression darkened. What truth? About Helen, Ethan snapped. About what really happened the night she disappeared, and why she felt the need to hide our daughter. Andrew's eyes flickered to Lauren, his smirk returning. Ah, so you figured it out. Took you long enough. Lauren stepped forward, her voice steady. Why did she hide me? What were you trying to do to her? Andrew chuckled darkly. Helen was always the sentimental type. She thought she could outsmart me, protect you by running away. but she underestimated how far I was willing to go. Ethan's blood boiled as he took a step closer. You killed her. Andrew's smirk widened. I didn't have to. She was already broken, running scared. I just nudged her in the right direction. Lauren's voice shook with anger. You destroyed her life, Wade. And mine. Andrew's expression turned cold. You were collateral damage, sweetheart. Nothing personal. Ethan clenched his fists, his voice a low growl. This ends now, Andrew. I'm taking you down. Andrew stood, his calm demeanor slipping as he met Ethan's gaze. You can try, big brother, but I don't think you're ready for what you'll find. Ethan and Lauren left Andrew's office in silence, the weight of his cryptic confession pressing down on them. For Ethan, the confrontation had confirmed his worst fears. Andrew had manipulated events surrounding Helen's death, and his involvement extended further than he'd ever imagined. For Lauren, it was the first time she'd faced someone who had played a direct role in shaping the tragedy of her life. As they stepped into the elevator, Lauren broke the silence. He didn't even flinch, she said, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. It's like he doesn't care about the damage he's done. He doesn't, Ethan replied, his tone grim. Andrew's always been ruthless. To him, people are just pieces on a chessboard. Lauren shook her head, her fingers fidgeting with the charm on her bracelet. It's hard to believe someone could be that cold. Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening. You've seen it firsthand now, but we're not done, Lauren. Andrew made a mistake today. He admitted more than he intended. Lauren looked at him, her brow furrowed. Do you really think we can stop him? We have to, Ethan said firmly. For Helen, and for you. Later that evening, they returned to Ethan's penthouse. Lauren sat on the couch, staring out at the city lights, her thoughts racing. Ethan watched her from the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of water. He could see the turmoil etched on her face, the doubt, the anger, the uncertainty. You're quiet, Ethan said, handing her a glass and sitting across from her. Lauren let out a shaky breath. It's just a lot to process. Everything I thought I knew about my life, it's all a lie. Ethan nodded. I understand. When Helen died, or when I thought she died, it felt like my entire world had been ripped away. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. Lauren met his gaze, her eyes glistening. Do you really think she was trying to protect me? Or was it just a way to run away? Ethan's heart ached at the doubt in her voice. Helen loved deeply. She wasn't the type to run unless she thought it was her only option. If she hid you, it was because she believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Lauren's grip on the glass tightened. But safe from what? From him. She gestured toward the direction of Andrew's office. What could he have done to her that was so terrible? I don't know, Ethan admitted. But we're going to find out. Lauren hesitated before asking. What if the truth is worse than we can handle? What if it changes everything? Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. The truth will set us free. Lauren, it might hurt, but it's better than living in the dark. Lauren nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Okay, she said softly. Let's find out. The next day, Ethan met with Richard Hayes to regroup. The investigator's office was cluttered with files and photographs, all related to Helen, Lauren, and Andrew. We need to move quickly, Hayes said as Ethan entered. Andrew knows we're closing in. He'll be trying to cover his tracks. Ethan nodded. Do you have anything new? Hayes gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. I've been digging into Andrew's financial records. There's a lot of shady activity, offshore accounts, shell companies. But one transaction caught my attention. He handed Ethan a document highlighting a wire transfer. This payment was made to a private security firm 2 weeks before Helen disappeared. The firm specializes in surveillance and, let's just say, unconventional solutions. Ethan's stomach turned. You think he hired them to go after Helen? It's likely, Hayes said. The timeline matches, and the firm's reputation aligns with Andrew's methods. Ethan clenched his fists, fury simmering beneath the surface. Do we have enough to expose him? Not yet, Hayes said, but we're close. I've tracked down a former employee of the firm who might be willing to talk. For the right price. Whatever it takes, Ethan said. Set it up. That evening, Ethan returned to the hotel to meet Lauren. She was waiting for him in the lounge, her demeanor calmer but still guarded. Any news? she asked as he sat down. We're making progress, Ethan said. Hayes found a lead, someone who might be able to confirm Andrew's involvement. Lauren exhaled slowly. Good. The sooner we end this, the better. Ethan studied her for a moment. How are you holding up? Lauren shrugged. I don't know. Part of me wants to know everything, but another part is scared of what we'll find. That's normal, Ethan said, but you're stronger than you think. Lauren gave him a faint smile. I hope so. They sat in silence for a moment before Lauren spoke again. Ethan, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret not digging into this sooner? Not questioning what happened to her back then? Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Every day, he admitted. I should have fought harder. Asked more questions, but I was so consumed by grief that I let myself believe the official story. It's my greatest regret. Lauren reached out, her hand brushing his. You're making up for it now. Ethan met her gaze, gratitude flickering in his eyes. Thank you. Lauren nodded, her expression resolute. Let's finish this. Ethan smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Andrew Walker sat in his sprawling office, his hand gripping a crystal glass filled with whiskey. The tension in his jaw betrayed the calm exterior he presented. Ethan's visit had unsettled him, and Lauren's presence had made things worse. His brother was digging too deep, and Andrew knew it was only a matter of time before his carefully constructed facade crumbled. Victor Brandt, his hired fixer, stood across the desk, his posture rigid and professional. You're losing control of the situation, Brandt said bluntly. Ethan and the girl are closing in. You need to act now. Andrew swirled the whiskey in his glass, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid. And what exactly do you suggest, Victor? Scare tactics haven't worked. Ethan's too stubborn, and the girl... He paused, his smirk faltering. She's a wild card. Brandt leaned forward, his tone measured. There's one option left. We eliminate the problem. Andrew's eyes snapped up, his smirk replaced by a cold glare. You mean Lauren? Brandt didn't flinch. She's the connection. Remove her, and Ethan has nothing to stand on. For a moment, Andrew considered the proposal. It was a cruel and final solution, but it would solve his problems, however. Something in him hesitated. The girl was an echo of Helen, a ghost from a past he had buried. Could he really erase her so easily? Not yet, Andrew said finally, setting the glass down with a deliberate clink. There's still a chance to control the narrative. If we make a move now, it could backfire. Brandt frowned but nodded. Then I'll keep an eye on them. But don't wait too long, Andrew. You're running out of time. Andrew waved him off, leaning back in his chair as Brandt left. He stared at the city skyline. His mind racing, Ethan had forced his hand, and Andrew knew there was no way out without consequences. Meanwhile, Ethan met with Richard Hayes in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. The former employee of Andrew's hired security firm, a man named Thomas Greer, sat across from them, his eyes darting nervously. I don't want any trouble, Greer said, his voice low. I'm only here because Hayes promised I'd be protected. You'll be safe, Ethan assured him. Just tell us what you know. Greer glanced at Hayes, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Greer began. I worked for the firm Andrew hired. My team was assigned to surveil someone, Helen Walker. She was on the move constantly, staying in cheap motels and keeping her daughter close. Ethan's stomach churned. Lauren, Greer nodded. We were told to keep our distance, but things changed. Andrew ordered us to bring her in. She must have caught on because she disappeared before we could act. Ethan leaned forward, his voice tight. And then what? Greer hesitated. She died. I don't know the details, but we were pulled off the case after that. Word was, Andrew cleaned up the mess. Ethan's fists clenched. You're telling me Andrew orchestrated her death? Greer shook his head. I can't say for sure, but I know he was involved. He didn't care about the collateral damage. Hayes placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him. Do you have any proof? Something we can use to expose Andrew? Greer hesitated again, before pulling out a flash drive. This is all I've got. Surveillance logs, emails, enough to connect the dots. Ethan took the drive, his expression grim. Thank you. Greer nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. I hope it helps. Back at Ethan's penthouse, He and Lauren pored over the contents of the flash drive. The logs detailed Helen's movements in the weeks leading up to her death, confirming that Andrew's team had been watching her closely. Emails between Andrew and the firm outlined his increasing frustration with Helen's evasion and his demands for a resolution. Lauren stared at the screen, her face pale. "He hunted her like an animal," she whispered. "My mother was running for her life, and he didn't stop." Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We have what we need now, Lauren. This is the proof that will take him down." Lauren turned to him, determination hardening her expression. "Then let's use it. No more waiting." The following morning, Ethan called a meeting with his legal team, presenting the evidence against Andrew. The lawyers were stunned by the magnitude of the revelations, but assured Ethan they would begin building a case. As Ethan left the meeting, his phone buzzed. It was Hayes. "We've got a problem," Hayes said. "Brandt's been tailing you and Lauren. He knows you've got something on Andrew." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How much time do we have?" "Not long," Hayes replied. "You need to act fast." Ethan hung up, his mind racing. Andrew's desperation was palpable, and Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before his brother made his next move. But this time, Ethan was ready. That night, as Ethan and Lauren sat in the penthouse, a sudden crash shattered the silence. The glass balcony door exploded inward, and a masked figure stepped through. A gun raised. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted, pushing Lauren behind the couch. The intruder moved quickly, scanning the room before spotting them. Ethan grabbed a heavy paperweight from the coffee table and hurled it at the figure, striking his arm. The gun clattered to the floor, and Ethan lunged forward. Tackling the man to the ground, Lauren scrambled to her feet, grabbing the gun. Her hands trembled as she pointed it at the intruder. "Don't move!" she shouted. Ethan wrestled the man's mask off, revealing Victor Brandt's face. Brandt glared up at them, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "You're making a mistake," Brandt growled. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Ethan glared down at him. "We know exactly who we're dealing with, and this time, you're going to answer for it." Ethan held Victor Brandt firmly against the floor, his heart pounding with adrenaline. Lauren stood a few feet away, her hands trembling as she kept the gun trained on Brandt. The intruder's cold glare never wavered, even as blood dripped from the cut on his forehead. "You don't have to do this," Brandt said, his voice steady despite the situation. "If you let me go, I can make this all disappear." Ethan scoffed. "You think I'm going to trust you after this? You broke into my home, threatened Lauren, and expect us to cut a deal?" Brandt smirked, his teeth glinting under the dim light. "You'd be surprised how many people do." "Not this time," Lauren interjected, her voice steadier now. "You're going to tell us everything." Brandt's smirk faltered, his gaze flicking between Lauren and Ethan. "Fine, but if I talk, Andrew will come after me." "That's not my problem," Ethan snapped, pulling Brandt to his feet and shoving him into a chair. "Start talking, or we'll make sure Andrew knows you failed." Brandt hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "All right, what do you want to know?" "Everything," Lauren said firmly, stepping closer. "Why did Andrew come after my mother? Why did he want her dead?" Brandt's expression darkened. Helen found out something she wasn't supposed to. She came across records, financial transactions, backdoor deals. That would have exposed Andrew's illegal activities. He tried to buy her silence, but she refused. When she threatened to go public, he decided she was a liability. Lauren's face paled, her hands lowering slightly. "So he killed her?" Brandt shook his head. "Not directly. He sent my team to track her, hoping to corner her and make her disappear quietly. But Helen was smarter than we expected. She kept moving, always staying one step ahead." Ethan clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "And Lauren? What about her?" "She was leverage," Brandt admitted. "Andrew thought if he could get to the kid, Helen would surrender, but she figured it out and left the baby at the orphanage before we could reach her." Lauren's voice trembled with emotion. "She sacrificed herself to protect me." Brandt nodded. "That's the truth. She tried to run, but Andrew's orders were clear. If she wouldn't comply, we were to eliminate her." Ethan leaned forward, his voice cold. "And you carried out those orders?" Brandt's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual arrogance. "Let's just say I don't ask questions when I'm paid well." Ethan's fist connected with Brandt's jaw, the impact sending him sprawling to the floor. Lauren gasped. But Ethan didn't care. You destroyed her life. And for what, money? Brandt groaned, wiping the blood from his mouth. You're angry, I get it, but hitting me won't bring her back. Lauren stepped between them, her expression fierce. Enough, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. We need him alive if we're going to take down Andrew. Ethan's chest heaved, his anger barely contained. Finally, he stepped back, nodding reluctantly. She's right, but you're going to help us, Brandt. Brandt looked up at him, his smirk replaced by a grimace. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, Lauren said, her voice icy, I'll make sure Andrew knows you told us everything. Brandt's eyes narrowed, the weight of her words sinking in. After a long pause, he sighed. Fine, I'll help, but you'll have to protect me when this is over. No promises, Ethan said. Start talking. Over the next hour, Brandt detailed Andrew's operations. He described offshore accounts, bribes to officials, and a network of allies who had helped Andrew maintain his empire. But the most damning revelation came when Brandt mentioned a safe hidden in Andrew's private estate. That safe has everything, Brandt said. Contracts, ledgers, recordings, all the evidence you need to bury him. Lauren frowned. Why would he keep something like that? Brandt shrugged. Insurance. Andrew's smart. He knows power is fleeting, and he likes to have leverage over his allies. Ethan exchanged a glance with Lauren. We need that safe. It won't be easy to get to, Brandt warned. The estate is heavily secured. Cameras, guards, the works. Good thing I'm not afraid of a challenge, Ethan said, his voice firm. Lauren, are you with me? Lauren hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'm with you. Ethan turned back to Brandt. You're coming too. If this goes south, you'll answer for it. Brandt raised his hands defensively. All right, but if we're doing this, we'll need a plan. The next morning, Ethan, Lauren, and Brandt gathered in Ethan's penthouse to finalize their strategy. Brandt sketched out the layout of Andrew's estate, marking key entry points and security measures. The safe is in his study, Brandt explained. It's biometric, fingerprint and code, but I know how to bypass it. Lauren leaned over the map, her brow furrowed. What about the guards? We'll need a distraction, Brandt said. Something to pull them away from the study long enough to get in and out. Ethan nodded. We'll figure it out, but this has to work. If we fail, Andrew will come after all of us. Brandt smirked. Then let's not fail. As the plan took shape, Lauren felt a mix of fear and determination. She was stepping into dangerous territory, but she knew it was the only way to uncover the truth and honor her mother's sacrifice. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. We've got this, Lauren. Together. Lauren nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Let's do it. The tension in Ethan's penthouse was palpable. As the trio reviewed the plan for what felt like the 100th time, the layout of Andrew's estate, scrawled across a blueprint on the table, seemed both a challenge and an opportunity. Every detail had been accounted for, every possible contingency considered. Yet, the stakes loomed over them, a reminder that failure wasn't an option. Ethan glanced at Lauren, who was sitting silently, her gaze fixed on the blueprint. You don't have to come with us, he said gently. This could get dangerous. Lauren looked up, her eyes steady. I'm not staying behind. This is about my mother. And about me, I need to see it through. Ethan nodded, pride and worry flickering in his expression. All right, but stick close to me. Brandt cleared his throat, drawing their attention. I hate to interrupt the bonding moment, but we've got a job to do. If we're going to pull this off, we need to move now. The estate security detail changes shifts at midnight, and that's our window. Ethan nodded. Then let's get ready. As the clock struck midnight, the trio arrived at the outskirts of Andrew's sprawling estate. The mansion loomed in the darkness, its high walls and patrolling guards making it look more like a fortress than a home. The night was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. Brandt led the way, his movements swift and calculated. There's a blind spot in the cameras along the east wall, he whispered. We'll climb over there. Lauren followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan brought up the rear, his focus sharp as he scanned their surroundings. The climb over the wall was quick and silent, and within minutes, They were crouched in the shadows of the garden. "The study's on the second floor," Brandt murmured, pointing to a window with dim light spilling out. "The safe is behind a bookshelf," Ethan nodded. "Let's move." The interior of the mansion was eerily quiet, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The trio navigated the hallways with precision, avoiding the occasional guard or camera. When they reached the study, Brandt motioned for them to stop. "Wait here," he said. "I'll disable the alarm on the door." Lauren watched as Brandt worked, her nerves on edge. She clutched the charm on her bracelet, drawing strength from the memory of her mother. This was for her, she reminded herself, for the truth Helen had died protecting. The soft click of the door unlocking broke her thoughts. Brandt pushed it open and gestured for them to enter. The study was lavishly decorated with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with books and artifacts. At the far end of the room, a large mahogany desk stood like a throne. "The safe is behind that shelf," Brandt said, moving quickly to a section of books. He pressed a hidden latch, and the shelf slid aside to reveal a sleek, high-tech safe. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the safe. "Can you open it?" Brandt smirked. "Watch and learn." He pulled out a small device from his bag, attaching it to the safe's biometric scanner. As the device hummed to life, Brandt entered a series of codes, his fingers flying over the keypad. Seconds later, the safe let out a soft beep, and the door swung open. Inside were neatly organized folders, USB drives, and a stack of cash. Brandt grabbed the folders and drives, handing them to Ethan. "This is what you need. Everything Andrew's been hiding." Ethan stared at the evidence, a mixture of triumph and anger washing over him. "This is it. We've got him." Lauren reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the folders. "These are the answers," she said softly. "All of them." Before they could celebrate, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Brandt cursed under his breath. "We've got company. Time to go." The trio slipped out of the study just as a pair of guards entered the hallway. For a moment, it seemed they would escape unnoticed, but one of the guards turned, his flashlight catching Lauren's face. "Hey!" the guard shouted, reaching for his radio. Ethan acted on instinct, grabbing a decorative vase from a nearby table and hurling it at the guard. The vase shattered, sending the man sprawling. Brandt tackled the second guard, subduing him with swift precision. "Let's move," Ethan hissed, pulling Lauren toward the exit. They raced through the mansion, the sound of alarms blaring behind them. Guards poured into the hallways, but the trio managed to stay one step ahead, weaving through the maze-like corridors. When they finally reached the garden, Ethan motioned for them to split up. "Lauren, stay with me," he said. "Brandt, create a distraction." Brandt nodded, a sly grin crossing his face. "I'm good at distractions." As Brandt drew the guards away, Ethan and Lauren climbed back over the wall and ran toward the car parked nearby. They dove inside just as Brandt appeared, sprinting toward them with guards in pursuit. Ethan slammed his foot on the gas, and the car roared to life, speeding into the night. The drive back to the city was tense, but filled with a sense of accomplishment. Lauren sat in the back seat, clutching the folders tightly. As if afraid they might disappear, Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. "We did it," he said. "This is the beginning of the end for Andrew." Lauren nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "For my mom, for everything she went through." Brandt, sitting in the passenger seat, smirked. "I told you I was worth keeping around." Ethan didn't respond, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. The evidence they had stolen was enough to expose Andrew and finally bring justice to Helen's memory. But the fight wasn't over yet. Ethan, Lauren, and Brandt returned to the penthouse just as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air, but there was no time to rest. The stolen evidence, folders brimming with contracts, financial records, and encrypted USB drives, was laid out on Ethan's dining table. Lauren sat down, her hands shaking as she opened the first folder. Her eyes scanned the documents, her breath catching at the sheer scope of Andrew's corruption. "This is unbelievable," she murmured. "There are bribes, fake companies, even payments to officials overseas." Ethan stood behind her, his jaw tight. "This is what Helen must have found. It's enough to destroy Andrew's empire." Brandt leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. Told you the safe was worth the trouble. Ethan ignored him, pulling out his phone to call Richard Hayes. The investigator picked up after the first ring. Hayes, Ethan said, his voice brisk. We have the evidence. I need you to coordinate with the authorities and trusted media outlets. This needs to go public immediately. On it, Hayes replied. Send me everything, and I'll get the ball rolling. Ethan ended the call and turned to Lauren. We're almost there. Once this goes out, Andrew won't be able to hide anymore. Lauren nodded, her determination unwavering. Let's finish this. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Hayes arranged for the evidence to be securely transferred to both the authorities and several investigative journalists. Ethan made calls to allies in his network, ensuring that when the news broke, it would be impossible for Andrew to suppress it. But Andrew wasn't going down without a fight. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his instincts warning him. Ethan. Andrew's voice drawled on the other end, calm but edged with menace. I see you've been busy. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. It's over, Andrew. I have everything. You can't stop this. Andrew chuckled darkly. You think a few documents and some recordings will bring me down? You've always underestimated me, big brother. This time you underestimated me. Ethan snapped. Your games end here. Andrew's tone shifted, colder now. You've forgotten one thing. Ethan, you're not the only one who can play dirty. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone, his mind racing. He turned to Lauren and Brandt, who were watching him with concern. That was Andrew, he knows. Brandt frowned. That's not good. If he's desperate, he'll pull out all the stops. Lauren's face paled. What does that mean for us? It means we need to be ready for anything, Ethan said firmly. As the evening approached, the first wave of news reports hit the airwaves. Headlines about Andrew's crimes spread like wildfire, painting a damning picture of his empire. Investigative journalists dissected the evidence. While legal experts speculated on the charges Andrew could face, social media exploded with outrage, the public demanding accountability. Ethan watched the coverage from the penthouse, satisfaction mingling with tension. He knew Andrew wouldn't go quietly. His suspicions were confirmed when the building's security system buzzed, alerting him to an incoming guest. Ethan glanced at the monitor and froze. Andrew stood in the lobby, flanked by two burly men in suits. He's here, Ethan said, his voice low. Lauren's eyes widened. What do we do? Ethan looked at Brandt. We're not running. If Andrew wants a confrontation, he'll get one. Brandt grinned, cracking his knuckles. Finally, some excitement. Minutes later, Andrew strode into the penthouse, his presence commanding. Despite the chaos surrounding him, the two men at his side scanned the room, their hands resting on concealed weapons. Well, Andrew said, his smirk firmly in place. Quite the operation you've got here, Ethan. I have to say, I'm impressed. Ethan stepped forward, his expression hard. Save it, Andrew. You're finished. Andrew chuckled, his gaze flicking to Lauren. And you must be the infamous Lauren, the spitting image of dear Helen. Lauren held her ground, her voice steady despite her fear. You don't get to talk about her. Andrew's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something colder. I underestimated you, he admitted, turning back to Ethan. I didn't think you had the guts to come after me. You brought this on yourself, Ethan said. Helen was your victim. But you won't make Lauren one too. Andrew's eyes narrowed. And what do you think you've accomplished? Ruining me doesn't bring her back. No, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. But it honors her memory, and it ensures you'll never hurt anyone else. Andrew's men shifted uneasily, sensing the tension in the room. Brandt, standing near the door, spoke up. You're outnumbered, Andrew. You might want to think twice about whatever you're planning. Andrew's smirk returned, but it lacked its usual confidence. This isn't over. He turned on his heel and walked out, his men following closely behind. The room fell silent, the weight of the confrontation lingering. Lauren exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. Is it really over? Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. Not yet, but it will be. As night fell, Ethan received a call from Hayes. It's done, the investigator said. The authorities are moving in on Andrew's assets. He won't have anywhere to hide. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you, Hayes, for everything. When he ended the call, he turned to Lauren, a small smile on his face. This is it, the beginning of the end. Lauren smiled back, her expression bittersweet. For her, Ethan agreed. The morning sun rose over New York City, its golden rays reflecting off the glass skyscrapers as the world woke to the headlines that dominated every news outlet. Andrew Walker's empire crumbles amid scandal. Read 1. Whistleblower exposes decades of corruption. Read another. Ethan and Lauren sat in the penthouse living room, the television broadcasting live footage of federal agents swarming Andrew's estate. Lauren watched in silence, clutching her bracelet tightly. The evidence they had exposed had done its job. Andrew's crimes were now public knowledge, and the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Ethan stood behind her, his expression unreadable as he listened to reporters dissecting Andrew's downfall. It's over, Lauren said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded, though the weight of the past still lingered. Almost. There's one last thing we need to do. That afternoon, Ethan and Lauren met with Richard Hayes at a courthouse downtown. The investigator handed them a final report, detailing the results of his work. The prosecutors have everything they need, Hayes said. Andrew will face charges for fraud, conspiracy, and even manslaughter if we push for it. And we will, Ethan said firmly. He needs to answer for what he did to Helen. Lauren glanced at the report, her fingers brushing over the pages. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for everything. Hayes smiled faintly. You two did the hard part. I just connected the dots. As they left the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled over them. For Lauren, it felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For Ethan, it was a long overdue reckoning for his brother's sins. Days later, Ethan and Lauren stood at a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. A new headstone had been placed among the rows, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. Helen Walker, beloved wife and mother, forever in our hearts. Lauren knelt by the grave, placing a small bouquet of lilies at its base. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, I hope you know how much you meant to us, and how hard we fought to honor you. Ethan stood behind her, his hands in his pockets as he gazed at the headstone. She'd be proud of you. Lauren, you're everything she wanted you to be. Strong, kind, and unyielding. Lauren looked up at him, her expression softening. I couldn't have done this without you. Ethan smiled faintly. We did it together, as a family. The word family hung in the air, carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. For so long, Ethan had been consumed by grief and regret, shutting himself off from the world. Now, standing beside Lauren, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what he had lost. Andrew's arrest made international news, the trial promising to be one of the most significant in decades. Witnesses came forward, and the evidence Ethan and Lauren had uncovered sealed his fate. The once untouchable magnate now faced life in prison, his empire reduced to ruins. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past would never fully heal. Still, he found solace in the bond he had forged with Lauren, a connection that transcended the pain and loss they had endured. Months later, Lauren stood outside a modest storefront in Brooklyn. The sign above the door read, Helen's Haven, a place for hope. Inside, the space had been transformed into a community center, offering resources for orphans and at-risk youth. It was Lauren's way of honoring her mother's memory while giving back to those who shared her struggles. Ethan walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets. It's perfect, he said, his voice filled with pride. Lauren smiled. It's everything I dreamed it could be. They stepped inside, the hum of activity filling the air as volunteers prepared for the grand opening. Lauren looked around, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. You've come a long way, Lauren. Your mother would be proud. Lauren turned to him, her eyes glistening. And what about you? Are you proud? Ethan smiled, the warmth in his expression unmistakable. More than you'll ever know. As they stood together, surrounded by the beginnings of something beautiful, Lauren realized that her journey wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about building a future. And for Ethan, it was a second chance to be the family he thought he'd lost forever. On a quiet evening months later, Ethan sat on the balcony of his penthouse, a glass of wine in hand. Lauren joined him, carrying a small photo album she had found in the box from her childhood. Together, they flipped through the pages, pausing at each image of Helen, her radiant smile capturing moments of joy that would never fade. "Do you think she ever imagined this?" Lauren asked, her voice soft. "That we'd find each other after everything?" Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. She always believed in hope, even when things seemed impossible." Lauren nodded, her heart full. "Then I'll keep believing too." As the city lights twinkled around them, Ethan and Lauren shared a quiet moment of reflection. The pain of the past had not disappeared, but it no longer defined them. Together, they had turned their grief into strength, their loss into love, and their despair into hope. And in that moment, they knew they were finally free.